This happened on New Year's Eve, back in 2022. I'm from Ohio, just outside of Cleveland, and I was flying home after finishing up a semester at the University of Rochester. I had to stay at school a week after the semester ended for personal reasons, so I, unfortunately, spent Christmas relatively alone. The flight itself was fine, but I'd already been in a sour mood before I even boarded the plane. I'm a big Browns fan, and as I was at the airport, the Browns lost their final game of the regular season to go 0-16, completely winless. And as a lifelong fan, it was a special kind of misery. I think we were the first team to go winless since like the 80s or something. To top it off, my flight was delayed, which ruined my family's plans for the night. Originally, we were all supposed to drive to my cousin's house together for a New Year's Eve party and stay the night. But because of the delay, my parents decided to leave early, taking the main car. I was stuck driving the spare car alone. I wasn't thrilled about making the trip solo, but Vera was always good company. I figured I'd make the most of it. By the time my Uber dropped me off from the airport, it was creeping on 10 o'clock. I didn't even bother unpacking. I just jammed all my stuff in the car, got Vera, locked up the house, and got on the road. The drive itself wasn't anything special, just miles of Ohio back roads, winding through empty fields and patches of forest. There wasn't much snow on the ground, just a light dusting, which was nice, since I hated driving in the snow. It was pitch black dark, though. The only light came from my headlights and the occasional farmhouse, with its porch light glowing faintly in the distance. About halfway into the trip, Vera started whining. At first, I thought she just wanted attention, but then she stood up, pacing in the passenger seat. That's when I realized she needed to go to the bathroom. I groaned, knowing there wasn't much else I could do but pull over. The next clearing I came across was small, barely enough space for the car, but it would have to do. I remembered noting to myself how dark it really was out there. If not for the patches of white snow here and there, I probably wouldn't have been able to see into the woods at all. That's right. I jammed my hands in my pockets and tried my best not to freeze to death. Vera didn't seem to care about the cold or the darkness. Classic golden retriever. "Bring Mr. Jar to the front entrance," she ordered. My heart began to race. A glance over my shoulder sent an awful flurry of red, and let her out, not even bothering to leash her. She sniffed around the edge of the trees, taking her sweet time. She didn't wander far, just enough to do her business. And that's when I heard it. All of a sudden, a loud crashing sound echoed from somewhere in the woods. It wasn't just a branch breaking. This sound, like something quite big, was heavier and deliberate, like someone or something was moving through the trees. I literally jumped from how loud it was. Imagine a grown man sprinting through the forest. That's genuinely what it sounded like. I scanned the darkness, squinting to make out anything, but it was too dark to see beyond the first few trees. Before I could react, Vera bolted directly into the woods. It was some worst nightmare type stuff, I'm telling you. She disappeared into the trees and I lost sight of her in mere seconds. I yelled her name over and over, but she didn't come back. She didn't come back. At that point, my heart was racing, and it started getting hard to breathe. The cold didn't help matters. I couldn't leave her out there. That wasn't an option. Without thinking, I ran into the woods blindly, yelling for her to come back. I didn't want to think about what she was chasing after, so I just ran, letting the adrenaline take over. The only light to aid me was my dim phone flashlight and the thin layer of snow on the ground. It was so dark I was practically running into the trees. I kept running, praying I'd find her before she caught up to whatever was in there. I ran until my lungs gave out from the cold, forcing me to take a break. After nearly falling over from exhaustion, I leaned up against a tree and felt myself about to break down. I honestly didn't know what to do. Then, finally, I saw her. She was crouched low and shivering, walking slowly toward me. Her tail was tucked tightly between her legs. I had never seen her like that before. She said, "Ah, and you like just the way you are." I dropped to my knees and embraced her. Relief flooded through me. She pressed against me, and I could feel her body trembling. Something had terrified her. That's when I snapped back to reality and realized how serious the situation was. We were still in the middle of the woods, and there was still something out there. I sprung up from my position and told Vera to follow me. This time, she obeyed and stuck by my side like her life depended on it. We started back to the car, but I had no idea if I was going the right way. As if things weren't bad enough, I damn near jumped out of my skin when I heard crashing from behind me. I didn't think. I just started running. Vera darted ahead of me, and I followed her, praying I didn't trip. The crashing sound didn't stop this time. It seemed like it was following us. I can't even tell you how scared I was in that moment. I genuinely felt like I was going to die. By some miracle, Vera led me straight back to the car, and I practically threw her inside before slamming the door shut. As I was jumping in the driver's seat, I glanced back towards the woods, and my stomach dropped. There were 3 figures standing at the edge of the woods, watching us. I jammed the keys in the ignition and floored it out of there. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I was still in shock. It wasn't until I had driven a few miles that I noticed Vera was bleeding. I started panicking as I realized there was a cut just below her shoulder blade. It was the one hostile cut. When I reached the city, she was the last person I wanted to see. Someone had stabbed her. I slammed on the brakes and ran around the car to the trunk. My mom always kept a first aid kit in every car, and for once, her insistence on being overly prepared paid off. I cleaned Vera's cut as best I could and wrapped it in gauze. She whimpered, and I worried that I was hurting her, but I knew I was doing the right thing. For the first time since the whole sequence had started, I felt myself begin to relax. It was over. I tried not to think about it for the rest of the drive, but I was just so shell-shocked that something like that had happened to me. I ended up not telling my parents or relatives. I don't know why. It just felt like one of those things you keep to yourself. What I'm about to tell you is something I still think about often, especially during this time of year. This happened on New Year's Eve, a few years ago. I was driving to my parents' house to celebrate the New Year with them. They live a few hours away, in upstate Pennsylvania, so I had left in the late afternoon, figuring I'd get there with plenty of time to spare. The drive was supposed to be simple. I'm the type who really enjoys long drives, so a nice peaceful drive would give me some much-needed time to think. But the weather had other plans. The snow started falling about an hour into my drive. At first it was light, just flurries dusting the windshield. Nothing to worry about. I thought the snowfall was actually quite pretty. But I'm pretty sure I jinxed myself. The further I drove, the harder the snow came down. It just kept falling and falling until I was literally in the middle of an honest-to-God blizzard. The highway turned slick and visibility dropped to almost nothing. My car, a little sedan, isn't exactly great in snow, so when the tires started slipping on even the smallest hills, I knew I had to pull over. There was no point in risking my life. It was my own fault for not planning out the drive better. Found a spot on the shoulder, far enough off the road to avoid passing cars. Not that there were many. I texted my parents about my situation, and they seemed worried sick. I tried to reassure them that everything would be okay, but I honestly wasn't too sure about that myself. I figured I'd wait out the worst of the storm, hoping it would just ease up. But the snow didn't let up. In fact, it only seemed to get worse from that point. It just kept coming, piling up around the car and on the road ahead. After an hour or so, it became clear I wasn't going anywhere that night. My dad offered to try and get out to me, but I told him that was a death wish. I told him that if the snow didn't let up, I'd call the police, which he begrudgingly accepted as a decent solution. I really didn't want to call the police, and I didn't have AAA either, so that wasn't an option. 244. I told myself the storm would have to let up eventually, and I decided that if it didn't by the time I got tired, I'd call the police. The thought of spending the night in the car made me uneasy. I didn't want to run out of gas trying to keep warm, and I was worried about killing the battery if I kept the lights or heat on too long. I sat there, turning the engine on and off every so often, trying to conserve what I could. I literally wanted to jump for joy. A snowplow pulled up beside me. I was saved. I rolled down the window as the driver leaned out of his. He was an older guy, maybe in his late 50s. He looked nice. He was wearing a thick jacket and had a black knit hat that was pulled down over his ears. I remember thinking his face was really wrinkly, if that makes sense. It looked weathered, like he had spent decades in harsh conditions. I expected him to say something, but he just stared at me for what seemed like an unusual amount of time. Eventually, he spoke, asking me if I was okay. He had a really gruff voice, definitely a smoker, and it was honestly kind of off-putting. I told him that I didn't think my car could handle the conditions, trying to be friendly but also keep my voice steady. He nodded, saying that I wouldn't get far in a storm like this, especially with the car I had. He paused for a few moments, as if he were considering what to say. I watched his eyes scan my back seat, like he was looking for something. I was just about to respond when he offered to give me a ride. I hesitated. Leaning against the vehicle, I looked at the road behind us. I was still trying to find the right words. I didn't know him, and yeah, he seemed a little strange, but he struck me as a genuine guy. Plus, staying put with my car all night would have been stupid. I asked him if he could drive me to where I was going, and he said it would be no problem. I then asked him what I should do about my car, to which he shrugged his shoulders and said, "Leave it." After a moment, I agreed. I grabbed my bag and climbed into the cab of the plow. At first, the warmth was comforting. I felt the tension in my shoulders start to ease as I settled into the seat. He asked me where I was headed, and I told him about my parents' house. I gave him directions, and he nodded again, but didn't say much after that. The silence wasn't awkward, but as the minutes passed, I started to feel more and more uncomfortable. That's when I noticed something odd. He wasn't driving in the direction of my parents' house. I knew because the navigation was literally pointing in the opposite direction. I mean, we were on a local highway. There were only 2 ways to go. I tried my best to sound calm and asked him if we were going the right way, in the most normal tone I could muster. I don't think I did a good job, though, because I could feel his demeanor slightly change with my question. Without looking at me, he told me we were taking a short detour and that the back roads would be better than the highway. I didn't know the area well enough to argue, but something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. We drove a little longer, and he did in fact get off the highway and start driving along some back road. Said, "That is insolidary? Excellent." At least the GPS said we were heading in the right direction, so I thought I was just being paranoid. Something in my gut was still telling me he was off though, so I started looking around the cab more closely. There were red flags everywhere. Empty liquor bottles rolled on the floor near his feet. There were torn up maps stuffed into the side pockets, and I caught a glimpse of a knife wedged between the seats. I felt my heart start pounding. You know that feeling where your heart just starts beating like crazy and you're worried other people can hear it? That's what was happening to me. By that time, I was also positive we weren't going the right way. The GPS kept recalibrating because he missed turn after turn, not even looking at it. I was panicking. As we continued driving, I spotted a house in the distance. It was the only one I'd seen for miles. I had to act. It felt like a lifeline. I waited until we got closer, took a deep breath, grabbed the door handle, and then kicked the door open as hard as I could. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I slammed into the ground and felt my leg flare up with pain. I didn't care, though. I got to my feet and started running toward the house. The man shouted something at me, and I glanced back to see him fumbling for something in the glove box, probably going for a gun for all I knew. I didn't look back again. I sprinted through the snow, trying not to slip until I reached the house. I pounded on the door, screaming for help. A man and woman opened it, and they basically pulled me inside. I collapsed onto the floor, trying to catch my breath. I told them what had just happened, and they didn't ask questions. They just called the police. By the time the cops arrived, the snowplow was gone. They said they'd keep an eye out and search the area, but in that storm, finding him was unlikely. They offered to give me a ride to my parents' house and even help me call someone to tow my car. I was beyond grateful. My dad was furious once he found out, and I haven't driven in the snow since. I always think about what might have happened had I not jumped out of the car when I did. I've never been one for parties. Even in college, I got sick of the whole going out culture pretty quickly, and I found that I always had more fun doing something meaningful with a few close friends. I'm from a rural area, northwestern Ontario. This happened a couple years ago. Ever since I was a kid, my dad and his buddies had a New Year's Eve tradition of going ice fishing while everyone else was celebrating the new year however they celebrated. My mom wasn't really in the picture, and we didn't have much extended family. So I grew up spending New Year's Eve on a frozen lake in the frigid cold with my dad, his brother, my brother, and my dad's friends. My dad isn't around anymore, and my brother moved to Chicago a number of years ago. But I still try and go ice fishing as much as possible, especially as a way to celebrate New Year's Eve. I'm not really sure why. I just feel like I have some kind of obligation to keep the tradition going. My two best friends, Nate and Trevor, are pretty rugged guys themselves. You know the type, those burly, lumberjack-looking dudes that seem more in touch with wilderness than society. That's honestly how I'd describe myself too. Anyway, the three of us tried to keep the tradition alive as best we could, which was great because spending New Year's Eve alone would be depressing as hell. Nate was the one driving that day. His truck was perfect for the job. Big tires, 4-wheel drive, and enough room in the back for all of our gear. We packed everything we needed: rods, tip-ups, bait, a sled to haul everything, and a small pop-up shelter to shield us from the worst of the cold. The forecast predicted a clear night, but in Ontario, You never trust the weather reports entirely. We were prepared for anything. At least, we thought we were. The lake we were heading to wasn't a well-known spot, and that's what we loved about it. It was tucked away, surrounded by thick trees, with a surface that stayed frozen solid, even in the milder parts of winter. It wasn't a place you'd stumble across unless you knew exactly where to look. As Nate navigated the snowy back roads, the excitement started to build. There's something about the quiet stillness of ice fishing. Just you, your friends, and the promise of the catch. Definitely beats drinking beer after beer at some random bar. As we pulled up to park near the trailhead, I noticed someone standing nearby. He was a few yards away, bundled up in heavy winter gear, but something about him didn't feel right. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at our truck. At first, I thought maybe he was just a fellow angler sizing us up, but then I saw him glance down at his phone, then back at us, then back at his phone again. For some reason, it didn't feel casual. I don't really know how to explain it. It just felt off. I muttered to my friends that guy was creeping me out. The two of them looked up. Trevor shrugged his shoulders and Nate nodded, but didn't say anything. Guess you didn't ask for good news. We were about to start unloading when the man suddenly rushed towards us, waving his arms wildly. I rolled the window down to hear what he was saying. He started screaming that we needed to come help him immediately and that his buddy had just fallen through the ice. He pointed at his phone, saying the other guy they were with just told him. He sounded frantic, and his desperation was definitely real. He didn't even think. Trevor opened his door and then we were all out, following the man as he took off down the trail toward the lake. We didn't stop to grab anything, not even our coats. The urgency in his voice was enough to override any second thoughts. The man was practically sprinting, and we had to jog to keep up. As we got closer to the lake, I started to notice something that didn't sit right. He wasn't leading us to the usual fishing spots. Instead, we were heading toward a more remote part of the shoreline, away from where the ice was thickest. I was about to stop following, but it was too late. They appeared in view before we could do anything. Two more men standing near the edge of the lake. They weren't dressed for fishing, and they weren't moving. They were just standing there, waiting. I glanced down at their hands. They were both armed. My blood ran cold. One of them yelled at us to stop right there as we approached. He raised his gun and pointed it directly at me. I honestly can't describe the feeling that you get when someone points a gun at you. I hope no one ever has to experience what I felt that day. My heart dropped as the man we had been following turned to face us, a smirk creeping across his face. We'd been set up. The second guy demanded Nate's keys, along with everything we had on our persons. Joss. Sleep. Stay awake in the box. Joe, don't let that happen again, I heard the guy say due to my translation. We didn't really have a choice. These guys didn't seem like they were messing around. Nate reached into his pocket and tossed the truck keys to the man, and the three of us emptied our pockets. I tried to hang on to my phone, but one of the men told me phones too. Nate said his was in the car, which they laughed about. I've never been more furious in my life. How could we have been so foolish? I clenched my fists, wishing those guys weren't armed. I would have taken all of them on. Within moments, they grabbed everything and walked us back up the path at gunpoint before one of the men sped off in Nate's car. The other two backed away into the woods, presumably to their own vehicle. I debated following them, but I figured that wouldn't be much help. We stood there for a moment, shivering, before Nate pulled out his phone. I knew he had lied about it being in the car. I honestly don't know what we would have done had he not thought quickly on his feet. Somehow, we still had service. He called the police, explaining everything as calmly as he could. The dispatcher told us to stay put, and we huddled together for warmth as we waited for help to arrive. I was still so unbelievably angry. Nate was the worst, though. He kept kicking nearby trees and cursing at the top of his lungs. There was nothing Trevor or I could do to calm him down. The whole thing had happened so fast, I was honestly still processing it all. Why the hell would there be people out in the middle of nowhere on New Year's Eve of all days? It didn't make any sense. I'll skip all the boring details. The cops took an official report and were gracious enough to drive us all back to Trevor's house, which was the closest. As you might expect, Nate's car was never located, and those people were never caught. The three of us still can't believe what had happened. Trevor thinks we just stumbled into the wrong people at the wrong time, that they weren't planning on robbing us, but we just so happened to be the perfect targets. I think that's possible, but it still feels so unlikely. Who just springs a trap on some random people in the spur of the moment? But it also wouldn't make sense for them to be waiting for us at such a secluded spot. They had no guarantee anyone would show up. I really have no idea what to make of this whole incident. It was the New Year's Eve of last year when my brother, sister, and I lived in our parents' house. They had a big property out in the country, so even though we were all adults, we all figured it was easier just to stay home for a few more years. I was 21 at the time. Hari Lahis, the body guardian. We threw a big New Year's party and invited a bunch of relatives over. The few kids that were there were all having their own separate kid-friendly party in the basement, so upstairs and outside was all adults. Everyone got pretty lit, which made the traditional family stuff a lot more fun. We had a big dinner, played some party games, talked about a whole bunch of stuff, and then set up some fireworks for midnight. It was a very good night all round. After ringing in the new year, everyone who brought kids left, and the rest of us partied on for a couple more hours before everyone else went home. My family and I watched TV for a bit to wind down, but by 3, we all called it a night and went up to bed. I remember trying to pass out from the drinks I had, but whenever I tried to lay down, I just felt nauseous as hell, like I was going to throw up. I started mindlessly scrolling on my phone while sipping on some water until I sobered up enough to sleep. Then, around 4 in the morning, I started hearing noises coming from downstairs. I knew that was weird because everybody in the house should have been in bed. It wasn't like anybody was getting up for work either, as everyone had the first off. I figured it was one of my family members stumbling out of bed to get something. I was curious, so I dragged myself out of bed and crept as quietly as I could to the top of the stairs. When I looked down, I saw 2 hooded men in the living room. I panicked and ducked back behind the corner, listening to them talk. I peeked down as the more sensible one of the 2 was heading outside with a huge bag of our stuff. The other guy lagged behind, trying to fit more in his bag. A few seconds after, he was alone. I charged downstairs and grabbed him at the last second. I pulled him back into a headlock, slamming the door shut. I took one arm off him to lock the door, but he broke free. I got a hold of him again with a looser grip, which he kept fighting against. "Let me go. What the hell are you doing? This is a citizen's arrest. You're not going anywhere." He resisted the arrest with everything he had, repeatedly trying to buck me off or get out of my grasp so he could get away. I made as much noise as possible to wake up my family, and I felt like I was winning for a moment. But then we got turned a certain way where the guy could see outside the window. We both saw his buddy get in the car and drive off without him, abandoning him. This sent the man into an absolute rage, as he knew he was screwed. One moment I had him restrained, and the next I was suddenly being hit in the face. I staggered back, nearly falling over as I tried to keep my drunken balance. We went blow for a few minutes, but I eventually managed to overpower the intruder and got him pinned on the ground. That's when the tears started. Please, please let me go. I swear we won't come back. I don't want to go back to jail. Do you get pinned down there too? Shut up! I'm scared. I don't want to go. They're gonna make me drop the soap. I'll lose my manhood. Of course, I didn't buck him off. No matter how much he kicked and screamed and tried to make me pity him, it took a few minutes for my family to finally wake up and call the police. And for that entire time, the burglar kept crying his eyes out. I was actually annoyed by it, to the point of being pissed off. Here I was, in my underwear, trying to sleep off a night of drinking, when I get woken up by some people breaking into my home, having to get into a fist fight with one of them. Yeah, never should have been complaining. It should have been me. Thankfully, he was mostly dried up by the time the cops arrived. I'd never seen such a sad, sorry little excuse for a man, like when his limp, cowering body got stuffed into the back of a cop car. He'd been to prison before, apparently, and he quite obviously didn't have a good time there. I just don't get why he kept committing crimes if he was so traumatized by the consequences. He had actually robbed 2 other houses that night and barely got away. As for me and my family, things just weren't the same after that. Our childhood home had just been violated. Knowing only one of the people responsible got caught and the other one was still out there didn't help us feel any better either. Will he be up soon? The robbery was the reason we all ended up getting our own place together, and my parents are considering selling the house. It pains me to think of it, all those childhood memories tainted in one moment by the actions of strangers. This story was inspired by a disturbing incident regarding a burglar named Aaron Good, who has been jailed following a burglary on New Year's Eve, where he was restrained and placed under a citizen's arrest after he broke into a man's house and fought him. Good, 24, from Cardiff, pleaded with the victim to release him before the officers arrived to arrest him. Good and another thief targeted a number of homes on December 31st of 2022. The first burglary occurred after he and another man gained access to a Ford Focus outside a house in Lisvine. They stole a credit card and keys to an old address. At the second address, they burgled. 2 jackets worth £500 each were taken, as well as a £1,000 watch. They also stole keys to a Range Rover, which they got inside of, and attempted to drive off. Good was unsuccessful at the next property where he was caught and detained by the homeowners. I was going to a New Year's Eve party my friend invited me to. I Ubered there, as I knew I would be drinking. That was the whole vibe of the party too. Everyone was just getting plastered that night, not having to worry about driving home later. Some guys were going crazy over beer pong all night, and there was a bunch of shenanigans in the pool in the backyard. People were making out and hooking out left and right, and I got hit on all night. None of the guys who hit on me were attractive, just like it usually goes. All the guys I would have wanted to hit on me must have been taken, as not a single one was inclined to interact with me. There was this one guy who was the worst out of all of them. He was this creepy bald dude who was more shit-faced than anyone. Unfortunately, he was also one of the only people who drove themselves to the party. Almost everyone else knew what they were getting into, so they got a ride one way or another. But this was one of those people who thought they could handle their liquor. I remember this guy hitting on me and saying a whole bunch of nothing. I was forced to hear a ton about his car under his loud, smelly, nasty mouth. The guy didn't look or smell like he knew how to brush his teeth, let alone take a shower. I couldn't shake him all night. Once he latched onto me. He wouldn't listen to me whenever I said I wasn't interested. He just pretended not to hear me. The only time I got any space was when he went to the bathroom, which luckily he did very frequently. And whenever he left, I tried as hard as I could to sneak off to a corner of the house where he couldn't find me. But he homed in on me every single time. And every time he came back, he joked about how he had broken the seal and just couldn't stop pissing, but I knew better than that. He was definitely doing something else in the bathroom, the way his eyes and face looked. It was obvious he was doing a little more than just alcohol. All night. The guy would slam back shot after shot, getting increasingly wasted, and every time he came out of the bathroom, he looked even more unhinged. It got to the point that he was no longer in control of himself. He was so trashed that he could barely speak, and he looked insane. That's also when he started crossing my physical boundaries, trying to hug me and put his arm around me, and I only let it go so far as to keep him from falling flat on his face a few times. Otherwise, I pushed him off with just as much force as he applied to me, which kept getting stronger and stronger until I reached a breaking point. I shoved him as hard as I could, screaming at him to get the hell away from me. He tumbled to the floor, and with the whole party's attention on him because of my screaming, he got laughed at by everyone. After a few attempts, he finally got back on his feet and ran over to a corner. Everyone avoided him and just kept their distance. The sun amid this strange scene, a Roddy Pop began to dance through it. I remember seeing him look totally distraught while crying like a drunk hobo. It was really hard to watch. He had been pushy all night, corrupting himself with more alcohol and substances until he lost control. He basically all he valued and was willing to sacrifice many things to get it. Now all that crap in his system was making his reaction to the situation 10 times worse. Getting rejected and then humiliated by an entire house full of people had to hurt quite bad. So, something got the better of me, and I felt pity for him. I approached him slowly, going to put a hand on his shoulder and tried to comfort him. But before I could even touch him, he turned around screaming. He lunged for my neck and started calling me a slut and every other slur under the sun, shouting so loud that he was spitting in my face. "You bitch! How dare you reject me? I'll kill you!" It only took a few seconds for people at the party to rip him off of me and kick him out. Even though he could barely walk, he still got in his car to drive away. Everyone heard the loud roar of his car starting up, and before anyone could think twice about letting him drive, he was making a U-turn through the front lawn and speeding down the street, not even capable of driving in a straight line. He disappeared around the corner, and that was the last anyone saw of him. After that, the night went on for a few more hours. We rang in the new year and kept partying, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. My mood had been ruined beyond repair, despite my friends' attempts to cheer me up. About half an hour after midnight, I went home to be alone. 2 days later, my friend from the party sent me a link to a news article that made my stomach drop. There had been a fatal accident on New Year's Eve, where a drunk driver smashed into someone, killing them. The photo of the driver who got arrested confirmed beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was the same guy who harassed me and drove away from the party way too drunk to drive. Some small minority of the mobs, no small part of it, sent verb. I know there wasn't much I could have done, but I still feel terrible. My heart goes out to the family of the victim. This story was inspired by a horrific incident regarding a Merritt Island man who had been arrested for his role in a deadly crash on New Year's Eve. Sounds terrible? Just after 9 p.m. on December 31st, officers with the Cocoa Beach Police Department responded to a report of a crash with multiple injuries on West Cocoa Beach Causeway. According to the police department, the officers arrived to find a crash involving two vehicles with an extended field of debris along the roadway. In addition to the drivers, investigators say each car had one passenger on board. They were all taken to local hospitals to be treated. One of the passengers, identified by police as 70-year-old Pamela Morrison of Barney, Georgia, later died from injuries sustained in the crash. According to police, a preliminary examination of the crash scene indicated that a rear-end collision had occurred at a high speed. Investigators ultimately determined that one of the drivers, later identified as 36-year-old Mark Vanicola, was traveling at a reckless speed while under the influence of alcohol when the crash occurred. Vanicola was taken into custody and booked into the Brevard County Jail and charged accordingly. One of the people injured in the crash is still in critical condition at a local hospital. Now, the police department's investigation into the sequence of events leading up to the crash is ongoing. I'm an officer of the New York Police Department. I've been all around the city, but one place I've returned to on several occasions is Times Square on New Year's Eve. We like to keep a sizable presence there, as it's the biggest crowd we ever see. We have a perimeter of security checkpoints and patrols all around and through the area. Our goal is to prevent as many crimes from happening as possible. We keep in contact with other officers in the vicinity, but for the most part, we all stick to our own designated areas. Times Square on that specific night is like nothing else. Everyone has to stay laser focused on everything around them. One year, I got posted up right next to a security checkpoint. There were a few other officers spaced out every 30 feet or so, along the fence too. These were the guys I would be most likely to call in for backup, and vice versa. While we were still a good 2 hours from the ball drop before things got to peak intensity, I noticed a suspicious man standing on the other side of the security fence. He was about 10 feet from it, and he was staring directly at me. I thought for a moment that he was looking at someone or something else, but it became clear that wasn't the case. There were so many people passing by in a blur on both sides of the fence that I only caught glimpses of him here and there, but he never moved from the same spot, and he never took his eyes off of me. I stared back at him to let him know I wasn't intimidated, but this didn't discourage him from staring at me. On the contrary, once he knew he had my attention, he smiled. He wasn't committing any crimes at that moment, but he sure was creeping me out. So I radioed over to some other nearby officers while I waited for them to make their way over through the crowd. I tried to seem as though I wasn't fixated on the man, but I still watched out for him. When the two of them arrived, I pointed the man out to them. "Hey, you see that guy over there? No, which one? Is he on this side or that side?" "That side, the one staring at us. This one is farther away." "What the hell is the matter with him?" My colleague pointed over in the direction of the man, and when I looked back, I was a little shocked to see that he had made his way right up to the barrier. I got creeped out and took my eyes off him for a few seconds to keep talking. "Yeah, that guy. You think something's wrong with him?" "Probably off the booger sugar, but that's not our problem." "What?" I turned around, and it was almost like the man had teleported right behind me. "Yeah, ha!" He kept staring at the three of us, smiling wider than ever before, but specifically looking at me. And then he smiled and began to look back at the surroundings. He then said, "Happy New Year's, pigs." I stepped back out of caution, but in an attempt to keep the crowd around us from panicking, I tried to keep things calm. "Happy holidays, sir. Is everything okay?" Then, out of nowhere, the creep pulled a machete from his pants and slashed the other officer standing next to me. They dropped instantly as I reached for my weapon, but the man was so quick that he swung the machete into the side of my head. I dropped down in pain, dazed, only able to hear the pandemonium and screaming. I saw my colleague bleeding from the base of his shoulder, trying to compress the wound and get to his feet. Then the shadow of the attacker stepped over me. He charged for my other colleague, and a few seconds later, I heard him scream too. If only I had acted quicker. If only I had drawn my weapon sooner. However, instead of going to attack others, the man returned to loom over me. He raised the machete into the air. I tried to reach for my weapon again, but it was almost like my body was moving in slow motion while the rest of the world went on around me. I thought this would be the final blow that would take me out. Just then, I heard a sound cut through the chaos, and my colleague next to me had pushed through and nailed the guy right in the shoulder. He dropped his machete, stiffened up, and collapsed to the ground at my feet as 500 volts of electricity fried him from the inside out. I was just starting to come to as the other officer surrounded the area and arrested the psycho. All three of us that he attacked were treated at the hospital, and thankfully, none of us suffered lasting injuries. Unfortunately, I had to take several weeks off from my wounds to heal, which included a minor concussion. The treatment for a concussion is supposed to be an extended period of as little brain activity as possible, but I couldn't stop thinking about the attack the whole time. I keep blaming myself for endangering my fellow officers and the people of New York. It's hard not to feel like an inferior police officer when some random radicalized freak got the better of me. I should have arrested him the moment he appeared inside the perimeter, instead of giving him the benefit of the doubt, like he was just a lost idiot. That was a mistake that could have cost many lives, including my own, that New Year's night. This story was inspired by a horrific incident regarding a man who attacked 3 New York police officers with a machete on New Year's Eve in 2022. A 20-year-old man named Trevor Bickford pleaded guilty to 3 counts of attempted slaying of the officers. It was alleged that the suspect was a terroristic extremist when he brutally attacked the 3 NYPD officers who were just doing their jobs by protecting the public during the Times Square New Year's Eve festivities. Thankfully, one of the officers' quick-thinking actions stopped the defendant's attack while minimizing the risks to the innocent bystanders, who easily might have become additional victims of the defendant's heinous violence. Scott, it was alleged that Bickford entered the security area of the Times Square security checkpoint, pulled out a machete, and struck an officer with the blade and another with the handle. He then swung the blade at a 3rd officer, who ultimately subdued him. Bickford later admitted he intended to take out as many cops before becoming a martyr himself. He has since been sentenced to 27 years in prison.